Were you aware that the mob, drug cartels, and some gangs have the same organizational structure as those used in corporate America? This is Robert Manni, host of Guys Radio, and this week my guest Jerold Zimmerman discusses it all in his book, Relentless. I've also got New York Times best-selling author James Swallow. We're going to talk about the latest in his Mark Dane series, Ghost. It all starts at 8 p.m. Pacific Time on KCAA Radio here in Southern California, 102.3, 106.5 FM, 1050 AM. The podcast and my YouTube drop tomorrow. Guys Radio, thanks for your support. Jerold L. Zimmerman, Ph.D., and he's written this book along with his writing partner, Daniel P. Forrest. It's called Relentless, The Forensics of Mobsters' Business Practices, and it's really fascinating. It's about how a lot of illegal organizations have crafted a very successful business to create an enduring brand, culture, and success, while so many of public and privately legal organizations have come crashing down, particularly this past year or so. So let me tell you a little bit about Jerold. He is a Ph.D., a globally recognized microeconomist, and author of 7 books, and he has taught organizational economics, accounting, and finance at the University of Rochester's Simon Business School for more than 40 years. He's also the founding editor of the Journal of Accounting and Economics. He's published 50 published studies and books, and including textbooks on economics and accounting. He's just an absolute whiz economically and understanding business, and I'm very pleased that he's on the show. So welcome to Guys Radio, Jerry Zimmerman, Ph.D.
Well, thank you for having me. It's an honor, and looking forward to our interview.
Okay, let's start at the beginning then, and we'll get into, I want you to also weave in who Daniel is and why he was so important to this book. But what was the aha moment when you realized the fact that the most enduring criminal enterprises all share a success template that provides successful business practices and supporting corporate cultures, and how that is different from many traditional companies?
The aha moment came when I asked the question, what allows these organizations, these criminal enterprises, to survive much longer than iconic brands like the Kodaks and the Blockbusters, in spite of the fact that you have enormous law enforcement resources devoted to trying to put them out of business? But I guess the real aha moment came when you realize that these criminal organizations can't use our traditional institutions of capitalism, like banks and insurance companies, and in particular the courts. They can't go to federal district court and sue over a bad drug deal. So they have to have alternative mechanisms that allow them to function, to move money around, and all of the other things that we take for granted.
Mm-hmm. How did you and Daniel, your co-author, he's the CEO of True, THRUUE, an expert consultancy that assists leaders in bridging the gap between corporate culture and corporate strategy. So he works with CEOs of traditional businesses. How did you guys come together and say, hey, there's a book here that we should collaborate on?
Well, it started when Daniel was a student in the MBA program at the University of Rochester, and he was one of my students. About 4 or 5 years ago, he gave me a call. He had a client that he was struggling with helping, and he wanted my input. And so I had a number of conversations with him about that client and a couple of other clients. And I mentioned the book to him, and he said, oh my gosh, send it to me. So it was a very early draft, and Daniel was instrumental in putting the corporate culture piece into the books. So there's really 4 things that we look at in the corporate governance. Besides culture is one of them. It's also, how do they assign decision-making responsibility? Who does what in the organization? Who becomes a shooter, and who runs the gambling operation? How do you measure these people's performance, and how are they compensated? And these are all the same questions that legal companies have to grapple with.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. It's interesting, you took on the American Mafia, the Sinaloa cartel, drug cartel, the Hells Angels, and then also the gangs, the Crips and the Bloods. What what did you learn that was similar, and how did you do your research on those? And what did you find in terms of similarities and differences between those four illegal organizations before we get to the more legal organizations?
Uh, the research came from a few interviews with district attorneys and U.S. attorneys and some criminal defense attorneys, but the vast bulk of the research came from published sources, books by Joe Bonanno and Sonny Barger, who started the Hells Angels. And these were very detailed descriptions of how these organizations worked. And there's a lot written on crime. There's thousands of crime books, but most of them are really just the history and who got whacked and who did what to whom. And very few of these studies actually dig down into how do these criminals run their organizations.
Hmm. And do you think that there was any mindfulness on their part as to setting these four pillars or being aware that they were in place and looking what other enterprises had done in the past that they could build off of? In other words, did the Crips look at what the Hells Angels have done, or is that totally random and coincidental?
I think it's more the latter than the former. The um, the American Mafia has its roots back in the Sicilian mafias, back in the late 1800s. And so when the Sicilian mafioso immigrated to primarily New York, there were these other Italian American gangs that were just doing petty crime. But the culture of the Italian and Sicilian mafia, namely the code of silence, omerta, the clan, the distrust of governments, that was all part of their DNA. Uh, and the American mafia, before the 20s, they were just doing street level gang kinds of crimes. It was really prohibition and the unintended consequence of prohibition in the United States that created the demand for alcohol. And it was these gangs that started supplying bootlegging and smuggling, and the ones that were good at it survived, and the ones that didn't faded away. Economists call this economic Darwinism. It's
Hmm.
the survival of the fittest, and that's what a competitive market gives us.
Okay. My special guest, Jerold L. Zimmerman, Ph.D. The name of the book is Relentless: The Forensics of Mobsters' Business Practices, which he wrote with his writing partner, Daniel P. Forrester. So, how about some mainstream corporations that are doing this well and others that have really failed at it?
Well, there's just kind of an endless list of companies that have run into trouble. One of the more recent ones is Wells Fargo and all of the problems they had with their branch banking operations. They had an incentive system that gave the branch managers big bonuses if they added new accounts. And some of these people were not very ethical and they were opening accounts in customers' names without their permission. And
Right.
when this all came to light, there were huge fines. A lot of people got fired. That's one example of a company that failed. Um, Another example of one is Kodak, which they were, as you know, the world's leading photographic company, but they couldn't adapt to the times. Even though they were in digital imaging, they couldn't compete with the Canons and the Nikons and eventually the smartphones. They
Okay.
couldn't adapt. Whereas you look at the American Mafia or the Sinaloa cartel, they were constantly adapting as new opportunities emerged in their marketplace.
Mhm. Let me ask you a question about this. So, the four pillars, though, the culture, the decision making, and the rules, measurement, and then the compensation. Let's take this. Let's take Kodak as an example. They didn't keep up with the times from a technology standpoint or having their pulse on the marketplace. But could you argue that they knew their culture and their decision making and their measurement and their dollars, compensation, but they just didn't keep up with the technology and the way the market was moving.
Well, they tried. I
Mhm.
mean, one of the benefits of being in Rochester for 45 years and teaching at the Simon School was I learned an awful lot about Kodak. I had a lot
Sure.
of Kodak students. It turns out the Kodak was not an imaging company. They were a coating company. They were really good at taking and putting down layers of chemicals on either film or on paper, and they were super at that. But when it came to digital imaging, even though they had top-notch scientists, they didn't have an organization of electrical engineers and people that could compete with the Sonys, the Panasonics. They tried to come out with a camcorder. At one point in time, Kodak had over a $1 billion business in Super 8 movie films. I assume that your baby pictures are probably on those.
Of course.
That entire market went away in 2 years, even though they came out with a product that it was inferior to what the Sony camcorders could do.
So is this, Jerold, is this a part of the culture then of the decision making and rule making, the measurements or the compensation? It sounds like the culture drives a lot of this in terms of how the corporation is going to adapt.
Well, they knew that digital imaging was coming, and they tried to adapt. They came out with their own digital cameras, but you have to, in a highly competitive world that we're in, it's hard to take a 40,000 or 50,000 person organization that's good, that's very, very good at coding stuff, and suddenly turn all of these 45,000 people into an organization that can compete with a company that's all they've done for the last 20 years is electronics.
Got it.
So it's really destructive capitalism that these companies, when their technology becomes obsolete, the vast majority of them go out of business.
Mhm.
We see that with Blockbuster. Uh,
Okay. Okay, again, let me, and I totally agree with you. So I'm just trying for a contextual standpoint and basis, point to where these organizations that failed have gone wrong. So let's take Blockbuster. You've got the culture, decision making, measurement, and the compensation. Again, they didn't keep up with, the changing in the consumer usage landscape because they could get things digitally instead of having to go rent a video. So which of those four pillars did they fail on?
well, I wouldn't say they failed on any of them. It's just the way markets work in capitalism. You look at what's going on with Barnes and Noble now.
Mhm.
They're struggling, and they just decided to change the way their corporate tasks are assigned. It used to be that the corporate headquarters told every bookstore exactly what books to carry, which didn't work in different parts of the country. So they just changed their task assignments and they're giving all of their store managers discretion to carry whatever books they think they can sell. So they're trying to adapt this. Now, whether it's going to work or not, we'll see. But companies thrash around a lot. Look at Sears. Sears was an iconic brand, but the market put them out of business. It wasn't that their four pillars were wrong. It's just that bad things happen with new technologies when they come along.
Could it be, when you look at the criminal enterprises that you studied, that the criminal enterprises have more elasticity in being able to make changes because they can do whatever they want. They can do things illegally. They can whack people, whereas public corporations are beholden to shareholder value. Is it an apples and oranges type of thing, or are the basic four pillar tenets even more important in a criminal organization?
Well, I would argue that they're critically important in all organizations.
Okay.
You're absolutely right, and it's a very good point that the criminals have a lot more freedom to use violence, and that gives them a lot of leverage. On the other hand, if they use too much violence, it's very counterproductive. And we see that going on among the Mexican cartels now, that the violence is destroying not just their cartels, but the whole fabric of the Mexican environment.
Mhm. What do you, okay, our special guest, Jerold L. Zimmerman, PhD, he and his partner, Daniel P. Forster, have co-written this book, Relentless, The Forensics of Mobsters' Business Practices. This is Guys Radio. We're talking about the four pillars for successful organizations and how a lot of the crime families really have their act together more so than a lot of legal enterprises. So do you think there's a difference in how the four pillars work for a private versus public corporation versus a startup?
Uh, Excellent question. And every organization has to have a unique set of four pillars that's designed for that particular organization. So the four pillars for Southwest Airlines, they have an incredibly strong culture. Uh, and their four pillars differ from the four pillars of, let's say, the Red Cross or the American Mafia. They all have cultures. They all have these three things, but you have to tailor them to your unique circumstance. And as your circumstances change, as your environment changes,